There are places science has not yet named. Dimensions folded between heartbeats, tucked behind the thin skin of reality. Most people live and die without ever knowing those places exist. Dr. Ernst Hartmann was not most people. For 11 years, working alone in a cluttered house on the edge of Los Angeles, the old scientist had built something impossible, a machine that could crack open the membrane between worlds and slip a person through to the other side. He called it a matter transmitter. He called it his masterpiece. His neighbors called it noise. On a Tuesday morning in 1983, an earthquake changed everything. Act 1, The Crack in the World, Scene 1. Two strangers and a bad day. Carrie Madison was already late. She was a television journalist. Sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who could conduct an interview in heels while mentally composing her next story. That morning she had an appointment with Dr. Hartman, whom her producer had dismissed as a harmless crank. Carrie wasn't so sure. The old man's letters had been too precise, too technical, too obsessed. To be the ramblings of a fool. She was driving through the canyon roads outside the city when the earth groaned beneath her. A small tremor, nothing major by California standards, but enough to send a loose boulder rolling off the hillside and into the road directly ahead of her. She braked hard, tires shrieked, her car swerved, and then she hit Dan Roebuck's pickup truck. Dan was an electrician, a big, practical man with steady hands and an impatient temperament, the kind of man who fixed things with tools rather than theories. He had been on his way to a job. Now his truck, his livelihood, his pride, sat crumpled at the front, steam hissing from a ruined radiator. They got out and looked at each other. "You were on my side of the road," Carrie said. "You hit me," Dan replied. They argued for a full 3 minutes, voices rising over the sound of birdsong and settling gravel, neither of them willing to yield an inch. By the time they had established that neither would ever apologize, they had also established that Carrie's car was drivable and Dan's was not. She left him standing beside his ruined truck. He watched her drive away and thought, "I hope I never see that woman again." Scene 2, the machine in the basement Dr. Hartman's house was full of books, papers, half-eaten sandwiches, and genius. It smelled like solder and old coffee. Every surface was covered. Every corner held a secret. He met Carrie at the door with the excitement of a man who had been waiting his entire life for someone to listen. "You came! You actually came!" He wrung her hand enthusiastically. Come in. Let me show you something that will change everything you think you know about the universe." Carrie switched on her portable tape recorder and followed him down to the basement. The machine dominated the room. It was a framework of copper tubing and coiled wire, roughly 6 feet tall, shaped like a doorway. At its center, the air shimmered faintly, not quite visible, like rain from summer asphalt, but wronger. Somehow, deeper. "A matter transmitter," Hartman said proudly. "It opens a corridor between this dimension and a parallel one. Another universe, running alongside our own, separated by the thinnest of quantum veils. I call that other world Vonya." "You've been there?" Carrie asked. "Only with instruments, probes, data packets." He adjusted his glasses. "The mathematics of travel are complete. I simply haven't yet had the courage to." The house shook. A second tremor, larger than the first. The lights flickered. Beakers fell from shelves. The machine hummed, crackled, and surged with white light. Hartman stumbled forward, straight into the field. He was gone. Not fallen. Not running. Simply gone. Between one heartbeat and the next, swallowed by a shimmer of light. Carrie stood alone in the silent basement, staring at the empty space where an old man had just ceased to exist. Dan returns 20 minutes later. Dan knocked on the front door. He had walked 3 miles, and his mood had not improved. He needed to call a tow truck, and his phone had died. He'd seen the woman's car in the driveway. He needed to use a landline, apologize as little as possible, and get on with his day. Carrie opened the door, white-faced and shaking. "The scientist," she said. "He just disappeared. Into his machine. I don't know what." Dan looked past her into the house. Sighed, went inside. He was an electrician, he understood machines. He descended to the basement, examined the transmitter, tested the connections, and reached forward to adjust a loose coupling near the central field. The air shimmered. He pulled his hand back fast, but not fast enough. The field had clipped his fingers. He felt a pull, a lurch, a sensation like falling upward, and then he was gone too. Carrie, standing in the doorway of the basement, watched Dan Roebuck vanish before her eyes. She stood there for 5 seconds, 10. Then she thought, "He's in there. Hartman is in there, and there's no one left to go after them." She stepped into the field. The world turned white and silent. Act 2, Vonya. Scene 4, Arrival. The first thing was the smell. Green and wet and ancient, like a forest that had never heard of cities. Carrie opened her eyes and found herself standing in a clearing, bordered by enormous, prehistoric trees, their canopies so high above her they formed a second sky. The light was amber gold and came from a sun slightly too large. The air was thick and warm and utterly, completely alive. She was alone. No Dan, no Hartman, no machine. The parallel world, she would later learn, did not deliver travelers to the same point. The transmitter's field scattered its passengers across a wide radius. Each of them had landed somewhere different in this vast, untamed wilderness called Vanya. Before Carrie could process any of this, the bushes parted. 5 men stepped out. They were large and primitively dressed, armed with clubs and spears, and they were looking at her with the focused attention of hunters who have just spotted something new and interesting. Carrie ran. She was fast. But they were faster, and they knew the terrain. Within 2 minutes, they had her surrounded. The leader grabbed her arm and spoke in a guttural language she couldn't understand. They did not harm her. That, at least, was something. Instead, they bound her wrists and marched her north through the jungle. She was a prisoner before she'd been in Vanya for 10 minutes. Scene 5. Dan Wakes Up Dan came to consciousness in a shallow river. He dragged himself to the bank, coughing and dripping, and sat for a moment taking stock. His tools were still on his belt. His pocket knife, his wire cutters, a small LED flashlight, everything he'd had in his pockets when the machine took him. In a world of swords and spears and cave-dwelling warriors, an electrician's toolkit was not entirely useless. He heard something move in the trees and went very still. A figure emerged, slim, slightly built, dressed in forest green, with pointed ears and wide, watchful eyes. An archer. He held a bow but had not drawn it. He watched Dan with careful curiosity. "I am called the Greenman," the figure said in accented but comprehensible English, or something so close to English that Dan's mind translated it automatically. "You come from the other place." Dan blinked. "You know about the other place?" "Others have come before. Rarely. Always through the same shimmer in the air." The Greenman tilted his head. "You seek someone?" "A woman and an old man. They came through the same shimmer." The Greenman was quiet for a moment. Then the woman was taken. Dan stood up. Taken by who? By traders working for Cleel. The name landed between them like something heavy. "Who's Cleel?" The Greenman's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very careful. "He rules the Eastern Territories. He collects things from the other place, your world. Weapons, devices, strange objects that give him power no one here understands." He paused. "He also collects people." Dan looked east. "How far?" Scene 6. The world of Cleel. They found Malachi on the road to the Eastern Territories. He was a small man, stocky, quick-eyed, with a ready grin and faster feet. A traveling merchant of questionable ethics and surprisingly useful information. He had been robbed 3 times that month, he said, which was nearly a record even for him. When he heard they were heading toward Cleel's fortress, he tried to leave. Dan blocked his path. "You know the territory," Dan said. "We need a guide." "What you need," Malachi replied, "is a different ambition. No one goes to Cleel's fortress and leaves again. Not voluntarily, anyway. Then we'll be the first." Malachi looked at the big man with the strange tools on his belt and at the silent archer in green and calculated his options. He had, as usual, very few. "I want half of whatever you find in there," he said. "Deal," said Dan. Malachi sighed and fell into step beside them. "We're all going to die." Inside the fortress, Cleel's fortress rose from the jungle like a fist. Stone walls 12 feet high, watchtowers manned by guards with crossbows, a heavy gate of timber and iron. Inside, the sound of a crowd, the smell of smoke and food and something darker underneath. Carrie sat in a stone cell with her wrists still bound and her tape recorder, somehow, still in her jacket pocket, still running. She had decided that if she was going to be a prisoner in another dimension, she was at least going to document it. The door opened and Cleel walked in. He was not what she had expected. He was tall and handsome in a way that might have been charming under other circumstances, dressed in leather and metal, moving with the easy authority of a man who had never needed to explain himself to anyone. He looked at Carrie with frank possessive interest. "You're from the other world," he said. His English was better than the Greenman's, more practiced. "I thought so. You have the look." "Where did you learn English?" Carrie asked. He smiled and held up his hand. On his wrist was a digital watch. On the table behind him, she could see other things. A transistor radio, partially dismantled. A compass, a pair of binoculars. "From others like you," he said. "Who came before?" His smile did not reach his eyes. "Some of them taught me many things before they stopped being useful." Carrie felt cold. What happened to them? "The arena," Cleel said pleasantly, as if it were the most natural answer in the world. "The people of Vanya need entertainment. The arena provides it." He studied her face. But you, I think you'd make a better companion than a combatant. You're far too interesting to waste. He left. Carrie turned her tape recorder over in her hands and began to think.
Succinate.
Hartman's fate, they found the old scientist on the second day. He was not a prisoner, not exactly. He was living in Cleel's fortress as a kind of involuntary consultant, working in a stone room filled with the devices and objects Cleel had collected from travelers over the years. Hartman had built them into something new, a crude but functional radio amplifier, a basic generator, small things that in Vanya seemed like sorcery. Cleel had realized immediately that the old man was valuable. He had been kept comfortable, given food and materials, and told, very gently but very clearly, that he was not going to leave. Hartman looked older than he had in the basement. Smaller. The excitement had gone out of his eyes, replaced by something haunted. I can't get the transmitter to work in reverse, he told Dan, his voice low and urgent when they found him. I've been trying. The machine here, what I've built, it has some of the components, but not all. I need specific parts, specific materials. What materials? Hartman listed them. Dan recognized about half. The rest he'd have to improvise. Can you build it if we get you everything on that list? The old man's eyes flickered. Just for a moment, the excitement came back. Yes, I believe I can. Dan nodded. Then that's the plan. We get Carrie out, we get the parts, we go home. He made it sound simple. He had already counted 19 guards between them and Carrie's cell. Act 3. The arena scene 9. The capture, they almost made it. The plan was good. Malachi as distraction. The green men covering from the shadows. Dan moving through the fortress with his LED flashlight acting as a kind of impossible torch in the torchlit darkness, drawing guards away from Carrie's corridor. They reached her cell. Dan got the door open. Carrie looked at him with enormous relief and also, very briefly with surprise, she had not expected to be rescued by the man whose truck she had destroyed. Don't say anything, Dan said. I wasn't going to, she replied. They turned around. 6 guards were blocking the corridor. Cleel stepped out from behind them, still smiling. I was wondering when someone would come for her, he said. He looked at Dan with genuine interest. You fought past 12 of my men to get this far. That's remarkable. He tilted his head. I think the arena was right for you after all. Scene 10. The night before, they were not kept in the same cell this time. Dan was taken to the fighters' quarters, a long room below the arena floor, full of men who had lost their own bids for freedom and were now waiting out their days in the only life left available to them. The arena. They were fighters from across Vanya. Big men, scarred men, men with the empty eyes of people who have stopped expecting things to change. Dan sat against the stone wall and thought. He had no sword, no shield, no training in the weapons of this world. He had wire cutters, a pocket knife, a length of electrical cord he'd coiled around his belt, and a flashlight with a battery that might last another 6 hours. In any rational calculation, he was going to die tomorrow. He pulled out the wire cutters and began to think about the arena. Vosk, the largest man in the room, a mountain of muscle who had been champion for 3 years and had killed 9 men in that time, sat down beside him, without being invited. You're the one from the other place, Vosk said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. What is that? Vosk pointed at the LED flashlight. Dan turned it on. Vosk flinched back, eyes wide, then leaned forward with hungry curiosity as Dan explained. For an hour, Dan talked. He talked about electricity, about light, about the difference between a weapon and a tool, and how sometimes they were the same thing. Vosk listened to every word with the focused attention of a man who has survived 3 years in an arena by understanding exactly what he's dealing with. By the time they were told to sleep, an arrangement had been reached. Scene 11, the arena, the main event. The arena was full. Cleel's fortress had a dedicated fighting ground, a circular pit of hard-packed earth 50 feet across, surrounded by tiered stone seating that could hold 200 people. The crowd that morning was at capacity. Traders, warriors, servants, hangers-on, all of them buzzing with the promise of entertainment. Cleel sat in the elevated box at the north end, Carrie beside him in a chair she had not chosen. Hartman stood in the shadows at the edge of the box, watching with sick helplessness. The announcer, a wiry man with a leather-lunged voice, described the bout, a man from the other world against Vosk the Undefeated, armed with whatever he had brought through the dimensional gate, a curiosity, a spectacle. The crowd laughed when Dan walked out. He looked wrong for the arena, too ordinary, no armor, no sword, no theatrics, just a big man in jeans and a work shirt, carrying what appeared to be a coil of wire and a small metal tool. Vosk walked in from the other gate and the laughter turned into a roar. 3 years of victories had made Vosk a celebrity. He was magnificent in his way, weaponless by choice today, planning to end this quickly with his bare hands. Vosk caught Dan's eye. Just for a moment, something passed between them. The gate dropped. What happened next, the crowd of Vanya would discuss for the rest of their lives, because they had no framework for it. They had paid to watch a human die in the arena. They had gotten something they couldn't understand. Dan moved fast, faster than anyone expected from a man of his size. He uncoiled the electrical cord as he ran, circling Vosk, drawing the big man's attention. Vosk played along, rotating, keeping pace, giving Dan the illusion of control. Then Dan reached the stone pillar at the edge of the arena, one of the decorative columns that Cleel had installed for grandeur. He had noticed it during his entrance. More importantly, he had noticed the iron torch bracket bolted to it, and the next pillar over, and the one after that. He worked fast, lashing one end of his cord to the iron bracket, running the length across the ground, connecting it to the second bracket and then the third in a rough triangle. The crowd watched in puzzled silence. Vosk watched. Cleel frowned. Then Dan took out his knife and with 3 quick cuts, exposed the copper core of the cord at multiple points. "Now!" Dan shouted. Vosk, who had agreed to this in the dark of the fighter's room, bellowed his battle cry and charged, but he angled his run carefully, staying outside the wire. The 2 remaining fighters Cleel had sent into the arena as backup, responding to shouted orders from above, came, charging in from both sides. Both ran through the wire. Dan had grounded the ends to the iron brackets in the stone. The wire itself, copper cord, running across wet earth, formed a primitive but real circuit. The moment the 2 charging fighters hit it, the circuit shorted. It was not electrocution. Dan's flashlight battery was not enough for that. But it was a sharp, violent shock that none of Vonya's warriors had ever felt before. They went down hard, twitching and confused, convinced they had been attacked by some invisible force. The crowd went absolutely silent. This was not how the arena worked. This had never happened in the arena. Dan stood in the center of the pit, wire cutters in hand, 2 men flat on the ground around him, and looked up at Cleel's box. "I want the woman," he said clearly, "and the old man, and we're walking out of here." Scene 12. Cleel's choice. Cleel rose from his seat. His expression was not the rage Carrie had expected. It was something colder and more dangerous, the look of a man recalculating. He had collected technology from the other world for years. He understood better than anyone in Vanya that what he had just witnessed was not magic. It was science. And science, in the right hands, could be reverse engineered, could be weaponized, could be used to hold an empire together or tear one down. The man in the arena had just demonstrated that he had knowledge Cleel wanted. But Cleel also had 200 people watching him, and he had built his reputation on one principle. In the arena, weakness was death. He raised his hand. His archers on the arena wall knocked their arrows and aimed at Dan. "Very impressive," Cleel said. "But you are still here, and I have 30 archers. Your wire trick won't save you from 30 arrows." Dan looked at the archers, looked at his remaining battery life, looked at the crowd. He made a decision. He switched on the LED flashlight and aimed it directly at Cleel's face. In 1983 Los Angeles, a small LED flashlight was a modest, unremarkable object. In a world where fire was the brightest artificial light anyone had ever seen, a focused beam of white LED light aimed at close range was something closer to divine. It was blinding. It was wrong. In a way that had no category. Cleel recoiled, shielding his eyes. In the arena, 200 people gasped, then fell silent. Then, from the back, began to murmur. The murmur grew. In Vanya's culture, as Dan had learned from Vosk in the night, there was a tradition. If a fighter in the arena demonstrated power beyond understanding, the crowd could demand mercy. It was old, it was rarely invoked, but it was real. The crowd began to chant, slowly at first, then louder. Vosk stepped to Dan's side and raised his fist. The chant became a roar. Cleel stood in his box with light in his eyes and the voice of his people in his ears and made the calculation that even the most ruthless ruler sometimes has to make. The cost of killing this man, right now, in front of everyone, was higher than the cost of letting him go. He lowered his hand. The archers held. Act 4, The Way Home, Scene 13, the parts the Greenman and Malachi had not been idle. While Dan held the arena, the 2 of them had located the storage room where Cleel kept his collected objects from the other world. The list Hartman had given Dan before the arena had been passed on. They worked quickly in the chaos of the crowd's chanting, finding what they could. A length of copper wire, 2 transistors from the dismantled radio, a battery pack from a camera that had come through the gate years ago, Hartman's own early notebooks, which Cleel had kept as curiosities without understanding a word of them. Not everything on the list, but enough. Hartman had said, "Enough." They met in the courtyard outside the arena gates. Dan, Carrie, Hartman, the Greenman, Malachi, and the freed prisoner Vosk who had decided without much deliberation that he was no longer interested in the arena and would be accompanying them out. How long? Dan asked Hartman. The old scientist looked at the parts, at his notebooks, at the blank sky of Vonia above them. He did the calculation. 3 hours, he said. If you can keep Cleel's men off us for 3 hours. Done, said Vosk, and picked up a very large stone. Scene 14, the build they made for the jungle. Cleel's men followed. Not in force, not yet. Cleel was still recalculating. But 6 scouts tracked them into the tree line, and by the second hour there were a dozen, circling, testing the edges of the group. The Greenman's arrows kept them at distance. Malachi laid trip lines and small traps. His trading life had given him a surprising knowledge of such things. Vosk stood at the clearing's edge and waited, with the patient menace of a man who has spent 3 years making other men reconsider. Dan sat beside Hartman and handed him tools and held things steady and did not ask questions, because the old man was working in a state of such absolute concentration that to interrupt him would have been a kind of violence. Carrie kept her tape recorder running. She would never broadcast the recording, but she kept it running. An hour passed. Then, just past the 3-hour mark, Hartman sat back on his heels and looked at the structure he had assembled from salvage and memory and 11 years of obsessive solitary work. It was ugly. It was held together with wire and hope. The central field shimmered faintly in the jungle light. It was a way home. Scene 15. Goodbye's Cleel appeared at the edge of the clearing just as Hartman was running the final checks. He came alone, which was either very brave or very calculated. He stood at the clearing's edge and looked at the machine with an expression that Carrie, watching him, would later describe as the most human thing she ever saw on his face. Pure, undisguised envy. He wanted it. He wanted to understand it. The machine represented everything he had been chasing since the first traveler fell out of the sky into his world. A door to a place of limitless power and impossible knowledge. Let me come with you, he said. No one had expected that. Dan looked at him for a long moment. And do what? Learn, Cleel said simply. I could learn. There was a silence in the clearing. The Greenman's bow was raised. Vosk had not moved. Malachi was calculating exits. You killed people in that arena, Carrie said. You kept people prisoner. You ruled this place through terror. Cleel met her eyes. Yes, he said. There was no apology in it, just acknowledgement. Then no, she said. Something crossed his face. Loss, maybe. Or just the hard landing of a calculation that hadn't worked out. He stepped back. The archers in the tree line lowered their bows. Hartman activated the field. Scene 16, what they left behind the Greenman did not come through. At the last moment, with the field humming and the light building, he stepped back. This is my world, he said simply. I will stay. Dan started to speak. Tell no one of Vanya, the Greenman said. It doesn't need what your world would bring to it. He looked at Dan steadily. You are a good man, traveler. Better than you know. He was gone into the trees before Dan could answer. Malachi did come through, tumbling forward at the last second, with his pockets full of Vonias, marketplace trinkets, and a grin that suggested he was already thinking about resale value. Vosk came through. They all came through, stumbling out of a shimmer in the air into Hartman's basement, smelling of jungle and smoke and another world's sky. The machine behind them sparked once and went dark. The field closed. Silence. Then Hartman began to cry, quietly with his hands over his face. Relief, mostly. And something else, the particular grief of a man who has finally done the thing he spent his life building toward and knows he will likely never do it again. Epilogue. Back in the world, it was a Tuesday afternoon in Los Angeles. Outside Hartman's windows, traffic moved. A dog barked. Somewhere down the street, a radio was playing. They sat in the old man's living room for a long time, saying very little. Vosk stood at the window and watched the street with the wide, careful eyes of a man, cataloging an entirely new world. He had decided, in the way of someone who has always made decisions quickly and lived with them completely, that this was where he would be now. Malachi was already trying to sell one of Vanya's copper arrowheads to Hartman for $20. Carrie looked at her tape recorder. The cassette had run out somewhere in the middle of the arena. She turned it over in her hands. Some stories, she thought, were not for broadcast. Dan sat beside her. They hadn't talked much yet, not about what had happened between them in Vonia, which was something and not nothing. Though neither of them had named it, they probably wouldn't name it today. Your truck, she said finally. Yeah, I'll pay for it. He looked at her sideways. Half. She thought about that, about the cavemen and the arena and a flashlight blinding a warlord in front of 200 people and a man from an alien world standing at a basement window watching Los Angeles. Half, she agreed. It was not, by any conventional measure, a romantic conclusion. But it was the beginning of something that was enough for now. Outside, The city continued its business, entirely unaware that in a basement on its outskirts, a door to another world had just closed, and that three people had come back through it carrying the particular, quiet weight of those who have seen something no one else would believe. Dr. Hartman went to his desk and opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the first page, he wrote one word, Vonya. Then he began from the beginning to write everything down, the end. They paid to watch a human die in the arena. He gave them a show they couldn't understand. Based on the 1983 film Prisoners of the Lost Universe. Directed by Terry Marcel, starring Richard Hatch, Kay Lenz, John Saxon. Story by Terry Marcel and Harry Robertson.